So, in this lecture, we're kind of bringing to a close our discussion of how um, how we can manage the economy once we realize that we're at a particular point on the business cycle. In the previous two chapters, chapters 15 and 16, we talked about the role of the federal government, right? And that came down to um, talking about things in terms of fiscal policy. So first we talked about, you know, how much the federal government spends on certain things, and then we talked about how the government can make adjustments to the aggregate demand curve. We're going to kind of repeat that same structure here in these next and last two chapters, but instead we're going to focus on the central bank. And in the United States, that central bank is called the Federal Reserve. And so to do that, first here in chapter 17, we're going to talk about, what is money, how the money supply can be altered by the Federal Reserve, and basically then what the Federal Reserve is. And then in the next chapter, we talk about uh, with the Federal Reserve, how it actually makes adjustments to the money supply, which we call monetary policy. Okay, so let's start. So, money. We're going to start off first again by talking about what is money and how it's created, and then talk about the part of it's called part of the economic foundation, um, which is the central bank in the United States called the Federal Reserve. And so we'll talk about what the Federal Reserve is, what it does, and how it primarily makes adjustments to the money supply. Okay, so the when we talk about money, one of the obvious mm, representations of money would just be paper bills and coins, right? That's pretty obvious, right? If you said, "Give me some money," and you gave someone coins, or you gave them paper bills, they would use those bills and coins to buy goods and services. The key definition of what money is that it's anything, and I do mean anything. It is anything that is generally accepted as a means of payment. So, as an example, I collect my salary as a state employee. Right, the university is a public institution. I accept my payment from the state in U.S. dollars. Why do I accept those US dollars? Because I use those same US dollars to buy the goods and services, that I need. Um, if I lived in Canada, then I would probably use the Canadian dollar, right, as both the form of payment that I wanted to receive and and that the reason why I would want it is because that's what I use for goods and services. I know what I'm about to say is going to be somewhat controversial, but if you just listen to the definition I gave you of what money is, this is the reason why I and many other economists don't consider cryptocurrencies or meme coins or whatever as money. Primarily because I don't know of anybody that accepts these as means of payment, and I don't know anybody who actually buys things with them. Yes, we can look up on the web and we can see that there are certain things that you can buy with a crypto. Like, right, I think you could buy a Tesla, I think, with Dogecoin. I think you can buy Domino's Pizza with Bitcoin, and I think you get tickets to a Lakers game. But these are pretty far and few extreme examples. Um, money, as this generally accepted form of payment, has to do three things. It serves as a medium of exchange, it's a unit of account, and it's a store of value. So let's talk about these functions as it serves them. So the most important function of money is that it is the medium of exchange. As we just kind of, as like what kind of just alluded to, it's what people trade for goods and services. And what it does is it makes an economy work quite efficiently. Because I don't have to go, right, as a person who, I don't know, I can fix my car and I can teach this class. Outside of that, my skill set is, oh, and I can drive very long distances. But outside of those things, I don't have a lot of other skills, right? So that would mean that if we existed in a barter society, one where you exchange goods and services, dude, I'd have to like keep doing those three things in order to get all the goods and services that I need. It's a lot easier, it's a lot faster, it's a lot less creepy to teach this class, get paid cash, currency, money, and then use that money to buy the other things. Now, we talk about, US dollars or coins as the money. But what we just said on the previous slide is that anything can serve as money. So when you used to be able to smoke cigarettes in prisons, cigarettes were the primary form of currency within a prison. Cigarettes were also used in POW camps during World War II in Germany because they were what were given to captured soldiers in their kind of Red Cross packages. In prison today, apparently it's postage stamps and mobile phone, cell phones and cell phone service cards are the primary things that have value. But again, those would just be different forms of money. We can think that in other times, let's say about 100 years ago, we used gold, right? Gold was our form of money. We had a gold standard in the United States. We had coins and paper bills, but they actually just represented gold that would be used. Barter, the problem with barter is that it has this problem of the double coincidence of wants. Each party has to want the thing that the other party has, and it becomes very difficult to always be satisfying this double coincidence of wants, where each party wants what the other one has. I mean, how many economics lectures does someone need, right? How often does someone need something driven a very far way away, right? I make a living basically selling my economics lectures, getting cash, and then using that cash for other things. Okay, so I just kind of gave you a mention, at least, that we have today in the United States and every country in the world use what's called a fiat money. That would mean that the money that we use is given value only by government fiat or government law. And so if you look on your dollar bill, it has this line. And basically, if you look on your dollar bill, it will say this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. It basically is saying it is that this dollar can be accepted to buy all the things that you will need. And right, and you get those lines of like where the person gets like, there's like a story once a year where someone gets like a parking ticket. They're really mad about getting that parking ticket, so they go down to City Hall with a big old bag of pennies, and then they pay their bill in pennies. Well, in some sense, it's just courtesy of the fact that it pretty much is U.S. law that um, you know cash U.S. dollars are accepted for all debts, public and private. Um, it we it was June the 5th, 1934, that we started to have a fiat money. Before that, we relied on the gold standard. And then we had some periods of time where we had a silver standard, but these are what we would call commodity-backed monies. So up until 1934 in the United States, you could take your dollar, go to any bank, and you would get a fixed amount of gold by turning in that dollar. And in fact, if you look on Wikipedia of what money used to look like in the United States, money in the United States used to be called a gold certificate because it basically just represented gold that you could turn it in for. These notes have been used ever since medieval times, when you used to not want to have to carry around gold because it's really heavy, and also because you can't break it up into smaller pieces. So what you would do is give it to a goldsmith to hold it for you, and then the goldsmith would give you a receipt, a piece of paper saying, yep, you deposited this gold. And so then what people would do is they would buy stuff, but they'd be like, well, I'm not carrying the gold on me, but here's my receipt, right, from the goldsmith. Here's a part of that. Yeah, you can just go turn it in and get the gold for yourself. That was kind of the emergence of money. And then money itself is also, the Chinese also state that they invented currency as well. So it depends on who you believe and what you believe here, but either the Western Europeans would claim that they invented it, or the Chinese would claim that they invented it. I really don't know what the honest truth is. I'm not a historian of money. Although I did take a class on it once. Those are passionate people. They really like their collecting of money. So, there's a temptation to see commodity money, the fact that it's linked to gold, and think, oh, that's the one we should totally do. But that's not necessarily the case. So let me talk to you a little bit about what the good things are and the bad things are about commodity money, and then I'll turn to fiat money. Yes, the commodity money is good in the sense that you've got something tangible, something that's realistic that it's tied to. You don't have to worry about trusting politicians or others that control the money supply because, you can only print as much money as you have gold. So you would have big limits on inflation because the money supply is controlled. But the problem with commodity money is that, as I just said, you can only print as much as you have of that commodity. So what we're going to see, especially in the next chapter, is that what you want to do sometimes is change the money supply in order to stimulate the economy, right, when you're in a recession. But you can't do that if you don't have more gold. And then there are these examples in United States history where recessions used to be caused because there was a recession that was caused, I think it was in the 1890s, because what had happened was that gold was loaded onto a ship in San Francisco. And this is all before the Panama Canal. So the ship then had to go like around South America, back up, the other side to get to the east coast of the United States. Well, the ship sank in a hurricane. And so what that meant is that the money supply dramatically fell, thus causing a recession. I mean, come on, that's pretty odd. But it goes the other way as well, right? Is that when gold was discovered in San Francisco, the economy could have inflation because now the money supply was dramatically increased. Having a fiat money is a bit more of a modern invention, something that we really see in the early 20th century. And, it's a bit risky. It's a bit risky because now we're relying, for instance, on the Federal Reserve, as we'll see here, to control the money supply, which, right, depending on your political beliefs and just depending on your ability to trust others, you might not trust that the Federal Reserve will control the money supply adequately. And also, right, you might just be, I mean, we saw it, right, that it's only 2 years ago that, 4 years ago, that we increased the money supply. We saw this in the previous lecture. We increased the money supply, sorry, not the previous chapter, but chapter 8, that we dramatically increased the money supply in 2020 by some 50%. That led to inflation. And all of the examples of hyperinflation that we have in U.S. history, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, 1920s Germany, all had rapid inflation caused by rapid monetary expansion. So a fiat money is nice because you can make adjustments as you think the economy needs, but it does rely on people not going crazy and printing too much cash. Okay, so money is a medium of exchange, and it's also a unit of account. So this is a pretty easy role that money serves, right? So we have 3 roles that money serves. Medium of exchange, here's our second one, unit of account. All that means is that it's the thing that we list the prices in, right? So here, it's just, if I were to say something is $10, you wouldn't say Canadian dollars, right? It would just be presumed that it's in US dollars. I don't ask what the currency is that people are using. I just presume that it's going to be in dollars. And when you go to a foreign country, right, sometimes they might appeal to tourists, that are using one kind of currency, and they might list prices in that other currency. But for the most part, we expect that prices are going to be listed in the currency that's in our country. So it just makes the record keeping a lot easier. And then the third thing that money serves is that it's a store of value, right? And as a store of value, that just means that basically over time, it retains some of that value and that you can use that in the future and that it will still have some of that same purchasing power. What we know is that the US dollar does store its value relatively well, that the dollar is only losing about 2 to 3% in value a year, and that's just caused by inflation. Other countries, inflation is much higher, thus people even in that own country don't want to be holding it. So for instance, when I lived in Zimbabwe for a little over a year, you didn't, if you didn't have to, you wouldn't use the Zimbabwe dollar. You'd use the US dollar because that would be what stored the value the best. And it's the reason why, along with the euro and the US dollar are the world's currencies, meaning that they are relied around the world, even outside the US. More US $100 bills are held outside the US than held within inside the United States. Okay, I'm going to pause here. So then now that we have an idea of what money is, the question would be what's the money supply? The money supply is important to understand because, again, that's how we're going to cause these changes in the money supply. We're going to cause these changes in the economy. So what economists do is they define money through a series of measures of liquidity. Liquidity is basically the how quickly something can be turned into cash. So something like actual cash is instantly liquid, right? Because cash is cash. But also beyond cash, we also have checkable deposits and savings deposits. So checkable deposits would be like writing a check. In most places, writing a check is accepted, can be used just like cash. These are all parts of M1. Building on M1 are things that are a little bit less liquid. So that would include things like money market mutual funds, small denomination time deposits, or what are called CDs. A CD, for instance, is something where you don't, you put you save your money, and then you agree to hold your money at the bank for, let's say, 6 months. And in exchange for holding it for 6 months, you get a slightly higher interest rate. So with that slightly higher interest rate, you the reason why you get it is because you agree to hold it there for that period of time. If you decide to take it out a little earlier, then you have to pay a penalty. So it's basically not as liquid. So M1, most liquid. M2, a little less liquid. And then we would think that the common ways that we access our checking and savings accounts, like debit cards aren't really money. They're just the way that we access the money. And credit cards are not money at all. It's essentially just a loan from another, from the bank that issued the credit card, right? And then we hopefully pay it back. We pay it back. If we didn't pay it back, then obviously you owe money on your credit card that you usually pay, with a transfer from your checking account. I don't want to look at old data, so let me get the new data. Okay. Sorry. And look at this. As we think about what we've all accomplished in this course so far, look at this. These terms are starting to all make sense to you, right? CPI, that was our measure of inflation. GDP and real GDP, that's our measure of production. Unemployment rate, unemployment, inflation. All these are things we understand. And now, look at that. M2. Let's look at this. And look at that. That's what I'm saying. I mean, in some sense, this is a little bit my critique here, but this is the problem with having a fiat money, is that, yes, COVID was a really disturbing event that happened, right? And it was going to cause a significant, it was going to have a significant outcome on the economy. To minimize what that outcome was, the Federal Reserve dramatically increased the money supply. And by dramatically, I mean that on the eve of COVID, the money supply was 15 trillion. And at its peak, it was 50% higher than that in about 2 years. That in about 2 years, the money supply increased by 50%. That would be the base understanding, at least for me, of how you get the inflation that we experienced in 2022, 2023, caused by that dramatic increase in the money supply. We can add to this our M1. We know that our M1 should be smaller than our M2 because M2 obviously adds to it. Okay, so we know that the M1 should be less than the M2. And obviously we're seeing that here. Right? The difference between the two has become smaller. So that would mean that part of the problem here is that the money supply, when it was increased, was that there was quite liquid cash that was being put out there that could obviously be spent quite quickly. So when we think about what depository banks do, that would be, right, your local bank where you have like a savings account or whatever, or checking account, is that what banks do is they collect deposits and then they take those deposits and they loan them to others who need money, right? So as a person who bought a house, right, I don't have the money for a house. That's why I went to the bank and got a loan. Where did the bank's money come from that they lent to me? It came from old women, right? That had nothing to do but save their money. And that was what was happening here. The banks are a financial intermediary. That just means that they exist, they make a business basically off of connecting old women and Scheiding who's needing to borrow money, right? And that they make a profit off of doing those kinds of things. Now, what we would generally see is that there's the way the bank makes money is that the interest rate is different for each type of thing that they do. That the interest rate on the loans should be higher than the interest rate they have to pay to get the money. Now they move together, right, in the same general directions, but there's always a difference. Except in this weird little time right here, the 2008-2009 crisis, but that was because the entire global economic system was collapsing. The entire banking industry was collapsing. Otherwise, you've got this big difference between the two. Where again, people borrowing money are paying more than what the bank needs to pay to get the money. And that basically the banks are making this difference between the two. Which if you're a person who buys stock in a bank, we would call that the net interest margin, the NIM. That would be the difference between these two. And so they use that difference between the two to give money to their shareholders, to pay all the expenses of the bank, to pay their employees, and to obviously generate profits. So to understand how banks as a business operate, what we need to do is we need to look at their balance sheet. So for those of you who've taken an accounting course before, you're going to be pretty happy right now. But essentially, when we create a T account or a balance sheet, on the left side we'll have assets, and on the right side we'll have liabilities and shareholder equity. Assets are anything that the firm owns. Liabilities are the obligations of the firm to others. And the owner equity is just the difference between the two. So if we look at this kind of sample balance sheet, well, we would see that for most banks, their largest asset is generally the loans they have made to others. The only other things that they really have that are of any value are they have some money right in a bank vault kind of thing, or they have reserves that are actually at the Federal Reserve. Or the other thing, in terms of what a bank can own, is they can own U.S. treasuries. So they can U.S. government debt. They can hold. They're allowed to hold U.S. government debt. You add up all that plus loans they make to other banks. That would be part of the other assets. All of these assets equal the right-hand side, with the largest liability typically being the deposits of people, because those deposits have to, that's a legal obligation that the bank has to make that depositor whole, to pay those things. Banks can also borrow money from other banks, and so just as they can own loans, they can also, just as they can make loans to others, they can also borrow money, and that borrowing would be here. And then again, the difference between that 800 and the 700 would be the shareholder equity, the $100 difference. Now, this becomes important because what we're going to see here is that as we change the amount of reserves, we'll then, or change the amount of deposits, we'll then change the amount of reserves, and we'll change the amount of the loans. And that this is going to cause problems for, it'll cause changes in the amount of loans that can be made, which then in turn changes how the economy operates. So, as we talk about each of these elements just a little bit more here, banks up until 2008 were required to keep reserves. They don't need to do this anymore. Banks used to be required, for the most part, to hold about 10% of their deposits. So that would mean if you deposited $100, they could lend out 90, but they had to put the other $10 into either their bank vault, or they would have to store it at the Federal Reserve. And that 10%, that would be our reserve ratio, right? Which would just be our, if we looked at that as a ratio, that would be our total reserves as a fraction of, as a portion of the total deposits. Okay, I'm not sure why we need a visual here. This is an antiquated system. It has now been 17 years since we had a system like this. Banks banks aren't at least required to hold any reserves. They can hold more than what they need to. And we're going to see that that's called excess reserves. So we basically have two parts here, right? So for our reserves, they can hold required reserves. That would be what they're legally required to keep. And then they can hold excess reserves. That would be the amount that's greater than what they were legally required to keep. When there's a concern that the bank does not have enough reserves, then there's what's called a bank run. We had a pretty big bank run not that long ago here in the United States. It was, I want to say, about 2 years ago. And it was Silicon Valley Bank, which failed 2 years ago in March, actually. So, and I'm making this here in March of 2025. The concern was made that that Silicon Valley Bank did not have enough money. And all the depositors then got incredibly worried that they would not get all their deposits back. So in that fear, they all tried to go and withdraw all their money at the same time. No bank, no matter how strong it is, can support everyone trying to take their money out at the same time. So during the Great Depression in the 1930s, some 10,000 banks failed. The only way they were able to stop bank runs was two things were done. First, the federal government basically shut down all of the banks for a number of days so that the banks could be evaluated as to how sound they were. And then what was created in 1933, the first year of the Franklin Roosevelt administration, was the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC. So I don't have a lot of money. I have certainly a lot less than $250,000. And the reason why I'm saying that amount is because everyone's deposits at a bank, as long as it's FDIC insured, you have insurance on your deposits up to $250,000. After that, technically speaking, you're not supposed to get more than the 250,000. But when Silicon Valley Bank was failing and other banks were failing, banks started to fail with a bit more frequently 2 years ago. And to stop that, the Biden administration and the FDIC chair decided to put no limit on the amount that you could get back. As to how they actually pay for that, I don't know. Yes, there is that scene in the Christmassy movie "It's a Wonderful Life," where there is a bank run scene, and these bank runs, yes, these bank runs caused, again, about 10,000 some banks to fail during the Great Depression. It was such an important issue that Franklin Roosevelt is known for giving these fireside chats, he would give these radio speeches shortly after he got elected. And his very first fireside chat was all about the banking crisis. So that goes to show you just how important it was. Okay, so yes, we have the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is a government agency which basically provides insurance for your deposits. What it does is most people aren't going to get worried about bank runs as long as they have less than $250,000. The only problem that's created by the FDIC is that no one pays as a person who saves money. I don't have a lot of incentive to make sure that the bank that I put my money in, that the bank is a good bank and that it protects the money, because I don't have to. I have insurance, right? FDIC. And to some extent, that is what causes big banks, again, like Silicon Valley Bank, to fail. Is that no one was really making sure that the bank was acting appropriately. Okay, so now what we need to talk about is how money is created. Well, the money is created by this idea that as long as you are putting the newly created cash into the bank, what does a bank naturally do? A bank lends out money. And you, the original $1,000 holder of the cash, deposited your money in the bank, and then the bank made a loan for $900, And when the bank makes a loan to someone else for $900, what do? They give the person a loan check, right? And that person eventually deposits that check. And now the total amount of money that exists out there is now $1,900. The original $1,000, and then now $900 more. And we would imagine that that $900, once it gets deposited, the next bank lends out 90% of that. So that would be $810. And so that now you've got $1,000 plus $900 plus $810. And then you would have 90% of 810. And then 90% of that, and 90% of that, right? If we're just using this 10% reserve ratio. And so that's what we see going on here. This is why understanding the bank balance sheet becomes so important, because this would be how we track the money creation process occurring. Is that the assets are increasing as loans are made, and those checks are then deposited, thus creating more deposits, which in turn creates more loans. And what it does is it allows that initial $1,000 to become $10,000. Because what we'll see here is what's called the simple deposit multiplier. Which is essentially 1 over the required reserve ratio. So in this case, you'd represent it as a decimal, 0.1, let's say if it were 10%, which is equal to 10. And then if we look at that, the initial amount of money times that factor would give me that $10,000. And so there you go right there. There's our simple money multiplier, money multiplier amount. So what that leads us to then is who controls then the amount of money that we have. And that would be the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is the central bank in the United States, and it essentially has 3 tasks. The most important task it has is conducting monetary policy, which is a fancier way of saying that they control the money supply. They engage in central banking activities. That means, as a fancier way of saying, it's like coordinating banks across the United States. And they are the bank for the government. And they are the lender of last resort. Meaning, when you can't get money from anyone else, the Federal Reserve will always lend it to you. Which is what they did for Silicon Valley Bank. And then the third thing that the central bank does is it does regulate banks. It imposes restrictions on what are allowable activities. Okay, I'm going to pause here. So when we look at what banks, the central bank does, again, the one thing it does is it is the bank for other banks. It holds the deposits of banks that choose to hold their deposits there. It holds, it kind of coordinates the way in which banks make loans to each other, and that would be what are called federal funds loans. And the interest rate that banks charge each other for an overnight loan is called the federal funds rate. And here's the important thing. When it's announced that the Federal Reserve is changing the interest rate, it's not really true. What the Federal Reserve is changing is what they would like the federal funds rate to be. Because the Federal Reserve doesn't determine what the interest rate is that banks charge each other for a loan. The interest rate that banks charge each other, that's determined by the banks that are lending the money. All they can do, all the central bank can do, is just try to alter the amount of money supply in order to make it create a lower targeted federal funds rate or interest rate that banks charge each other for a loan. The only interest rate that the Federal Reserve actually directly controls is called the discount rate. The discount rate is the interest rate that the Federal Reserve charges when you borrow directly from it. So long ago, when the Federal Reserve was created back in 1913, the Federal Reserve would have a discount window. It was basically like a bank teller window. And that bank teller window, right, you could be a bank, you would go to that window, and you could get a loan. Now, the Federal Reserve doesn't like getting asked for money because it typically means you're pretty desperate because you'd probably want to borrow from other banks first. So you really don't want to have to borrow from the Federal Reserve. Now let's go to this. Let's go to this here, and let's just look at what that discount rate is right now. So we can see here that really since COVID, we've been in an environment where the discount rate is incredibly low, essentially 0.25. And it really has not changed that much. And then obviously what we see here is that we had periods of time here right before, right, we see this kind of steady increase that was happening here. This was under when Ben Bernanke was the Federal Reserve Chairman. And this was his attempt to slow the economy down by reducing the money supply and raising the interest rate. Right. And if we go, I'm not sure why this data is not that new. It's not the same thing though. It doesn't matter. But here's one thing you can see here is that as the inflation was happening in 2022, that the solution to that inflation was again to try to slow the economy down, but not slow it down too much that you cause a recession. And you can see, and this is pretty historic, that in a 1 year time period, we went from a discount rate that was 0.25 to a discount rate a little about 18 months later that was 5.5. That's dramatic. That's a dramatic increase in the interest rate. That increase right there is actually what caused Silicon Valley Bank to fail. If you're interested in knowing more about Silicon Valley Bank's failure, send me an email. I actually made a video about it when it happened 2 years ago when I was teaching this class. So if you're interested in learning more about it, yeah, you could Google it or Wikipedia it. But if you just ask me, I will give you the YouTube links. that I made. I just made some short videos about it. Okay. So when we think about the central bank, what we're trying to do here, actually, I'm not sure why the authors of the textbook didn't show this to you. So what you can see here, just even in this kind of quick map, you can see here that kind of like Hunger Games, we are in District 12, which is a pretty broad area. Goes all the way right from like Utah, Idaho, Arizona, all the way out to, again, Alaska, Hawaii. And then you've got other districts, which is just like just the state of New York or half the state of Pennsylvania. Actually, Pennsylvania is a commonwealth, not a state. But I mean, that's what you're seeing here. This map was drawn in 1913. So this is kind of where economic activity was all happening on the East Coast, not so much on the West Coast. I worked for 3 years in District 7 at the Chicago District Bank. I worked there right after I graduated from college. And I worked on regional economic issues. So I looked at basically things that affected this area. What would that be? That would be primarily automobile production, looking at supply chains, railroads, things that are kind of unique to the District 7 economy. 9 is well known for its research on grain and agriculture. The FRED, the Federal Reserve Economic Database, that's District 8. That's the St. Louis Fed. And so on and so forth. So when we talk about what the central bank does to control the money supply, it essentially has 3 tools that it can use to change the money supply. It can change the interest rate that it pays on reserves. It can buy or sell existing government securities. That's what are called open market operations. Or, as we saw, it can use the discount window, which would be lending money directly to banks. So let's look at each of these. The paying of interest on reserves, that really only started during the 2008 financial crisis. And it's what's called the IORB. That would be the interest on reserve balances. And basically what the Federal Reserve can do is it can make it more or less attractive for the banks that you and I deal with, for banks to keep their reserves at the Federal Reserve. If they don't keep it at the Federal Reserve, then what they would do is lend it to other banks. Essentially what that would mean is that, what does a bank do with its money? It would either make a loan to another bank, make a loan to a consumer, which would be basically the preferred thing that it does, or hold it at the Federal Reserve. And if you raise the IORB, if you raise the interest rate, for banks, what they'll get paid by the Federal Reserve, then banks aren't going to want to hold. They're not going to want to make as many loans. So banks will hold more reserves to the extent that the IORB is a little bit higher. If the IORB is lower, then banks are going to want to make more loans. And what we can see here, at least, is that, again, banks were, the central bank, the Federal Reserve, was really trying to discourage banks from from making as many loans. So they wanted to push banks to hold more reserves with it, which essentially reduces the money supply. And there you go, right? You can kind of see this here. What it causes is it caused banks to begin to hold a lot of excess reserves. And that's what we can see here. So we don't live in a world anymore where we have scarce reserves. Most banks, well, actually every bank is holding more than is legally required, because banks today in the United States are not legally required to hold anything. Banks are holding excess reserves and getting paid a lot in interest by the Federal Reserve for holding those excess reserves. But the most common thing that the central bank does, that the Federal Reserve does, is it engages in what are called open market operations, which are the buying and selling of U.S. government securities. When the central bank buys U.S. government securities from individuals or banks that are holding them, then it pays it with money that it just created. Thus, the central bank would be increasing the money supply. If the central bank sells some of the securities it's holding, then, then it would be collecting the money from the others, and then it would be basically ripping that money up, which would thus cause a decrease in the money supply. So buying securities increases the money supply, selling securities decreases the money supply. And so open market operations are the most important thing that the central bank does. When you hear reports in the news that the Federal Reserve is changing the interest rate, this is what they're meaning. Because what we're seeing here increases the money supply, which in turn reduces the interest rate, which in turn increases the loans made. So essentially we're going to see consumption going up, we're going to see investment going up, which in turn would cause the GDP to go up. So that's what you can see would happen. If you thought that you were in a recessionary gap, this is kind of the beginnings of the next chapter. If you had monetary policy, if you wanted to do it because you thought you were going to be entering a recession, then the central bank, the Federal Reserve, would say we're going to buy securities, which will increase the money supply, which will reduce the interest rate, increase the amount of loans made, thus increasing the GDP. Now, why are these two connected, increasing the money supply and the interest rate? Is because you've got basically a demand and supply graph where you've got interest rate on the y-axis, quantity of money on the x-axis. Sorry, it's supposed to be a straight line. You've got your money supply here, and you've got your demand for money here. And if I increase the money supply, what we can see is that the interest rate has fallen. Okay, this is just another way of looking at it, so I'm just going to skip this for right now. Since 2008, another thing that's been done is what's called quantitative easing, which is when the central banks targets specific markets. We saw this, the big one we would have seen it with were mortgage-backed securities. And the Federal Reserve was also buying long-term securities in order to lower the interest rate in the long term. And in 2008, it increased the money supply by nearly $2 trillion with this form of quantitative easing. Again, targeting specific markets by changing the money supply, using these open market operations in those specific markets. Although the discount window was only supposed to be used by depository banks, what we also saw with the 2008-2009 crisis is that other entities could also borrow from the Federal Reserve. The big ones would be other banks, depository banks. State and local governments could borrow directly from the Federal Reserve, as well as hospitals and other nonprofits. And so we put that all together now to kind of bring us to the last chapter, where now we would talk about how the Federal Reserve uses its tools that it has available, the interest that it pays on reserves, the open market operations, and the discount loans, how it uses these things to change the money supply, which in turn changes the real GDP. By changing where the aggregate demand curve is. That's what we'll be seeing in the next chapter.